I have a question for the panel myself, and that's looking at one of the things that is soundly based in theory, the way we make decisions. One of the things that Frank pointed out and was alluded to actually in Jeremy's talk about scripts and so forth. There's really two ways we decide things. There's the on-the-spot decision-making, which is typically done in the sort of System 1 mode, the rapid working from scripts mode. And then there's the policy, the how we do things, which is typically done much more in the analytic systems 2, sort of slow thinking mode. That difference between those two modes of thinking is one of the best established phenomena in cognitive psychology. And yet when I read through implementation science studies, I often can't tell which mode this study is trying to address. What's the intervention trying to do? And have they thought about the fact that the tools that you need for supporting on-the-spot decision-making of the sort you want versus changing people's decision policies, those are different tool sets. How do we put that into, how does that play out in the kind of research you do? How do we get that kind of basic science insight into implementation science and into implementation studies?
Well, if I can respond first, others I'm sure have their own perspectives, but my take is this is a very, very infant science, and we do not yet have the connectors to all of the important things that we need to be looking at, which is why, you know, when Jeremy calls for narrowing down, I argue with him, because I think we're not at the point where we're ready to narrow because we don't have enough yet of all the things we need. And I don't know the answers to why cognitive science and cognitive psychology has not been well represented. I suspect it's a matter of social networks, quite frankly. I think that the reality is that although it's a burgeoning field and expanding quite rapidly at this point, we still have, you know, a fairly small number of people working in the field, and it's all dependent on what they studied, what they initially learned, and who they're networked with. I mean, Jeremy talked about the health psychologists that he's worked with extensively in the UK. They bring a very specific perspective, and that perspective has, you know, one very small category that encompasses all of cognitive and decision science. That clearly has to change. And so those, I think, are insights that are really important, and I think asking the questions is critical. And I think, you know, getting people to, but again, it's tough. You know, you've got people who have, you know, are running 20 projects already and essentially have their dance cards filled for the next probably 5 to 10 years. We need more people in the field, but I would say with a big but, we need people coming into the field who are willing to learn what's already been learned and not start from zero and assume that it's a blank slate. Because I think there is a body of literature, and there are many cognate bodies of literature that people need to learn. So it's not a simple field to start off in. And it requires, frankly, a willingness and commitment to spend a lot of time getting up and running in order to be able to get to the kinds of things you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. And isn't there a third means? You know, whether Obama health care gets overturned or not, something is going to have to take its place. And there's going to be a large cost containment component to it. And my understanding is that external sources are going to start making those decisions in terms of what they're going to reimburse. And of course, you always hear MRI is always brought up about excessive MRIs. So if it's not done by the people in the field now, it's going to be done by people outside the field based on what decision process, sort of like the formulary, who knows? Maybe that's something that should be studied.
I think that those of us who are practitioners in the room here already experience that. It may not be coming from an accountable elected body, but anybody here ever not have to fight with an insurance company about whether a procedure was going to be reimbursed? So yeah, those decisions are already being influenced by third-party actors. Not necessarily with any kind of rigorous study behind the choice they've made. Okay, Van.
Actually, that's a segue to my question. In thinking about costs, reflecting Dean Smith's comment and Frank Yates' comment about the people who are deciding are also involved in the decision. In looking at the development of the new knowledge and its implementation, and at the University of Michigan, where we have an academic component and the health system is actually a very large business component, who should be funding the work that we're talking about? We have an existing system, but should that system be changed, and what should we look toward or work toward for the goals you've been suggesting?
Do you mean
Yeah.
clinically, or who should be funding the research? Anybody and everybody.
You mean the National Institute for Implementation Science?
We could use something like that. Who should be funding? I think NIH should be funding it, but you know that's a long-standing issue. Is that you know what you learn in schools? You go from pilot studies to to efficacy, and then you go to effectiveness, and then you go to dissemination. Well, I mean, how many effectiveness trials did NIH really fund over the years? The model I learned in school really wasn't happening that much. I think that has to change. I think it's starting to change. I think I've seen a lot of progress over the last 5 years. But maybe it's just seeing what I want to see.
What about the role of other people chipping in? Scott, I know some of the work you do is in collaboration with health systems. Some of the work that our team is doing is an intervention funded by Blue Cross Blue Shield and a study of it funded by ARC. What about that kind of model?
Yeah, I think it does have to be a collaborative model like that. I think Blue Cross Blue Shield is actually, of Michigan, is actually a very progressive organization. I think they do not view themselves as funding implementation science. They view themselves as funding implementation of best practices, but they understand that in the process of doing so, we learn quite a bit. And they are actually quite very encouraging of us to disseminate the lessons that we learn and have a vested interest in doing so. It ultimately leads to improvement of their other quality collaboratives that they're working on. It advances the field, and that ultimately benefits their customers, their patients, everybody. So they are certainly part of this. They are not going to fund or support something where we have no idea whether it's going to work or what's going to work, and allow us to go out to hospitals and say, let's just try and figure it out. That's not what they would support. That would be a partnership with, say, AHRQ, where we say, hey, we have the infrastructure in which we can actually do this study in a subset of hospitals. But that partnership, I think, is going to be increasingly common.
If I could just add, so the other half of my appointment, as Marita said, that when she introduced me, is in the VA. And VA has been funding this kind of work for over a decade now. And I think it's actually a telling reality that the largest publicly funded system we have in this country spends a considerable amount of time, energy, and money on these issues. And I don't think that we do it necessarily as well as we could and should. But I think that it is an exemplar. And just as a note, VA actually requires a cost assessment as part of all of the implementation pieces. So, because they have to bear the cost. and I think that is one of the places where, you know, the craziness of the non-system that currently exists throughout most of the U.S. is a real factor, that people think that they can divorce these things, and they're not divorceable. You know, but I do think the VA offers one model. Unfortunately, it's not a model that you can take outside of the VA.
Well, we can do one last question.
Yeah, I would like to have the panel comment on this new development of hybrid trials that are hybrids between implementation and effectiveness trials. And and there are different levels, how much of the one or the other. Could you comment on that a little bit more and kind of guide us what your thoughts are about that? Because right now we are already going away from these old models of RCT and efficacy first, and so we are actually already moving, and the field is moving, and NIH is moving in that direction. So can you give us some guidance and your thoughts about that?
Sure, I think they're a great development. I think it is the way the field needs to go. I would say it's a formalization of mixed methods. And the only thing that worries me a little bit is that the way that's being set up is you have hybrid type 1, type 2, mixed hybrid 3. Categorizing it, I think, at this point is premature. I think that they are already somewhat straitjacketed. And I think instead, what that substitutes for is people really learning what the fundamental principles that you're trying to elicit and understand by doing quantitative and qualitative at the same time should be. And I think people are, again, applying formulas rather than thinking through the real design problems. That's my biggest concern. But having said that, I recognize, particularly as people are starting out in this area, it's helpful to have guidance and to have some statements of what makes sense. And I think that those designs, and I know several of the people who've written papers in the area, good people, and I think that what they're describing is important and useful.
With that, I'd like to thank our panel for their excellent insights and our audience for their insightful questions. Thank you very much.